Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about Network Policy Server. In this video, we'll start off by taking a look at something called Radius. Now, the reason we're going to look at Radius is because Network Policy Server is Microsoft's implementation of Radius. After we talk a little bit about Radius, we'll check in with Global Mantics and see what's going on with them and what their latest and greatest needs are and how Network Policy Server can help satisfy those needs. Then we'll actually go into the operating system and install the Network Policy Server role. And then I'll show you how to use NPS as a Radius server for both network policies and then also for accounting. So, what is this Radius? Well, the letters in Radius stand for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. So now you know what Radius is. Now, anyway, so what does it really stand for? Well, Radius is an industry standard protocol. Okay, so Radius is not a Microsoft thing. Radius is an industry standard, and it's something that is used to provide authentication, authorization, and accounting services for remote connectivity to a local network. So basically, Radius can be used to help control who can gain access to your network. It can put certain stipulations that must be met in order to gain access to the network. And it can also keep an account of who's been accessing the network and for how long and when and all that good stuff. Now, as I said a few moments ago, Microsoft uses NPS, Network Policy Server, for its implementation of Radius. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of take you back through time and show you how Radius has been used. Now, originally, Radius was primarily used exclusively by the ISPs, by your internet service providers. And I actually don't even have a picture of that here. The original use primarily for Radius was for the ISPs to keep an account of how long each of their clients had been connected to the internet. Now, if you think way back when, I mean, you have to go back a decade or two ago, we used to actually have to purchase certain plans with our ISPs. They worked a lot like how today's cellular phone plans work, where you had X number of minutes or X number of hours that you could be on the internet in any given month for a certain fee. And the way that this worked was for users to dial into their ISP, and at the ISP there would be a Radius server who would then keep track of who was calling in and for how long. And that's how they knew when your time was up. Now, shortly after that, we pretty quickly evolved into the day and age where you could dial into your ISP and you could get on the internet for an unlimited amount of time. But we were still in the age of dial-up. And in that age of dial-up, we had the need for users to be able to go ahead and dial in or connect in via remote access to our corporate networks. But the problem that we would run into is that we might have, let's say 100 users who are all out traveling around the world and would then need to dial into our local network. Well, it wasn't cost effective to set up a bank of 100 modems to satisfy these 100 phone calls. I know I only have one here, but I can make an attempt at drawing 100 lines and it might just take a while. But you get the idea. You get a lot of people all trying to call in. You're going to need a lot of modems. Well, it really wasn't cost effective, especially when we had our ISPs which already were equipped with these massive modem banks who could accept all these phone calls. So what we would do is we would go ahead and create an agreement with an ISP to go ahead and have a remote access server set up at the ISP. The users would then, wherever they might be around the world, would go ahead and dial in to the ISP because they were already equipped with the modem bank and connect to the remote access server there. Well, the problem with that is, why do we want remote access managed out at the ISP? Well, we don't. So what we would have is we would have a connection to the internet, and we would have a relationship already set up so that as the user dialed into the remote access server at the ISP, that remote access server would then go across the internet and connect with the radius server within our own local network, who would then authenticate the user via Active Directory, and then also give the approval as to whether this user was allowed access or not, send that back to the remote access server, who would then tell the user whether they were getting in or not. Once this was all done, the user now would have access to the internal network. But the management of that connectivity was still all done here at in a local radius server within our own network, which would not only authorize and determine whether the user was allowed, really I should say authenticate and authorize, those would be the official terms, but as well the radius server would keep an account as to who was connecting in, if that was important to the company. So that is something that was done for a good many years while we were still in the age of dial-up. But now that we're past the age of dial-up, we now have scenarios where we have a lot of users who are connecting from all around their various locations within the country, within the world, wherever it may be. They're all connected to the internet, right? They all have their high-speed connections into the internet. And they are all going to do what? They're going to VPN into our corporate network. Well, when you get enough users in enough different locations, you may need more than just one remote access VPN server. You may need multiple servers to be able to handle all the users who are coming in. But you may want to have centralized control over all of those servers. And that's where the radius server comes into play. What we can do is have all the users connect to whatever remote access server is available, and then have those remote access servers go ahead and connect to the radius server, and then have the radius server go ahead and do the authentication and the authorization within Active Directory. And the rest of this is pretty much the same as when the remote access servers were at the ISP. As a matter of fact, if we take a good look at this picture, you'll notice that the process flow, right? User connects to the remote access server, who connects to the radius server, who verifies things with Active Directory, and sends back the response back to the client as to whether they're getting in or not. Well, this is exactly the same as what we saw in the previous slide. The only difference is that the remote access servers are now in our own local network as opposed to being out at the ISP. Alright, so what's going on in Global Mantix Network? Well, what's going on is exactly what I just described to you. Global Mantix now has multiple remote access servers throughout its network, and they want to centralize the management of those remote access servers. We need to go in and set this up. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the network policy server role onto one of our servers. We're going to go ahead and configure that server as a radius server. We're then going to configure the remote access server, and I will mention this remote access server right here is the one that we already set up in the last video. So if you did not go through the previous video and or did not follow along with the previous video, please take the time to set up a remote access server if you want to follow along in this video. But we're going to take that remote access server and configure it as a radius client to then communicate with our newly formed radius server. On the radius server, we're going to then create a network policy. Okay, and we're going to take a look at how this network policy is a set of rules that the client will have to meet in order to make the connection into our network. And then we'll go ahead and go on to a client and test this policy and see if it works. So let's go ahead and get this going right now. For this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use New York DC1 as our network policy server. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that it's a domain controller and you don't like to add a whole lot of additional services to your domain controller. And that's true. you don't want to add a lot of services to your domain controller. But if there is one you're going to add, I'll tell you what, Network Policy Server is not a bad role to add to this server. And the reason why is because Network Policy Server is going to have to go ahead and check in with Active Directory services anyway. So why not go ahead and have it on the same server? But I will tell you that this could be done on a server of its own, a member server of its own, or it can be done on a domain controller, either way. So let's go ahead and connect to New York DC1 now. And once on New York DC1, we need to first start off by installing the Network Policy Server role. And we do this by clicking Start and going to Server Manager. Once in the Server Manager, we need to go ahead and click on Roles. And right now it'll briefly collect the data to try to figure out what roles it currently has. And you know we have a number of roles that we've actually already put on this server. So this is a good example of where you have a domain controller doing a lot of other things already, and this would be typical of a small company. A small company, it's not that uncommon to have a single server using all these different roles. And the roles that I see here, really don't put a huge burden on the server. It's very common to have, Active Directory, DHCP, DNS on one server. You may even deploy from that server. And file services, well, that's just simply saying, look, we're going to share files. So let's add one more role. I'm going to click Add Roles. And the role that we want to add is the Network Policy and Access Services role. Now, this is the same role that we added in the previous video to New York Member 1. But the difference is, let me go ahead and click on Next. I'm going to click Next through the welcome screen here, or the brief description screen really is what it is. In this case, instead of installing remote access services, I'm going to install the Network Policy Server role service. So I'm going to click Next and Install. Now, this will take a few minutes to install, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll continue as soon as this is complete. Okay, the installation has succeeded. We have our nice green circle with the check mark in it. So let's go ahead and close this wizard. And then I'm going to go ahead and close the Server Manager window. And where we need to go next is Start, Administrative Tools, Network Policy Server. Here in the Network Policy Server window, you will see a number of things here. Here is where it says Radius Clients and Servers. And you'll notice here that we have Radius Clients, which is currently blank, Remote Radius Server Groups, which is basically, you see here it says you can forward connection requests from the local NPS server when it's configured as a Radius proxy. Now let me explain what that means. What it means is that NPS can also be used not just as a Radius server, but as a Radius proxy, which is really nothing more than it can play middleman type role to where it will accept requests and pass them on to a Radius server. So for all intents and purposes, you can have a remote access server connect to this network policy server, who will then further connect onto the actual NPS server set up as the Radius server. This would be pretty much if you ended up needing to have an elaborate hierarchy of Radius servers all pointing to one central location. Now we'll come back to this Radius clients in just a minute, because as you can see, there's none set up right now. But I want to show you that what we also have here is we have our policies. Okay, and so we have the one in particular that we're going to look at here is going to be the network policies. These are the policies that are going to be able to stipulate certain specific criteria that have to be met so as to make the connection with our remote access servers. Down here we have network access protection. This is something that we've covered in previous courses. Network access protection is where you can go ahead and set up certain requirements that a computer must maintain, we'll say, is probably the best way to describe it. An example might be making sure that anybody who wants to connect to the network has all the latest security updates installed, or has their virus protection up to date, and things like that. And then of course down here we have accounting, and this is where we can keep an account of who's connecting and when and for how long, etc., etc. Okay, coming back up here. If we come back up here to Radius clients and servers, you'll see here we have an opportunity to go ahead and configure our Radius clients. So I'm going to click on that link, and you'll notice that takes us right into the Radius clients. And so I guess the manual way is you could just expand it and click on Radius clients. But I'm going to go ahead and right click and say New Radius Client. Now the friendly name, I'm just going to go ahead and say New York. I'm actually going to call it exactly what it is. New York Mem1 2K8. That is the name of the actual server. And for an IP address, well, 192.168. Now, do you remember what it is? It's .10.1. Okay, if we want to verify this, I can go ahead and minimize New York DC1, connect to New York Member 1, and you'll see here if we go to a command prompt, ipconfig, 10.1 was the internal network. Okay, so we have 10.1. I'm going to minimize New York Member 1, go back to New York DC1. I could click verify and click resolve, or more specifically, I could say New York Mem1 2K8 and click resolve. And you'll see it resolves to either 10.1 or 11.1. Those are the two IP addresses. And of course, 10.1 is what we want, so I'll click OK. And then here, we get to go ahead and specify what we want to use from a specific vendor. And you'll see that there's a lot of different vendors out there that support Radius. And we're just going to use the default Radius standard. You would only need to go to a specific vendor if you were going to be using something specific to that vendor within your network. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and put in a shared secret. Now this shared secret is something that's going to also have to be entered on the remote access server, aka Radius client, in order to make connectivity. So I'm just going to put in 1234, something nice and simple for right now, just for testing purposes, and then we can click OK. Okay, so we now have the Radius client configured on the Radius server. But what we now need to do is go back to that Radius client and point to the Radius server. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize New York DC1 and go back to New York Member 1. And on New York Member 1, I'm going to go into Start, Administrative Tools, Routing and Remote Access. And of course, remember, this is the remote access VPN server that we had already previously configured. And then what I'm going to do is right-click on the server itself and go to Properties. And on the Property sheet, we're going to go to the Security tab. Now, one thing I will mention before we go any further is, in the last video, you may recall that when we first set up this remote access server, we were given the option to go ahead and make it a Radius client as part of that original wizard. We were asked if we wanted this server to be one of multiple remote access servers pointing to a Radius server, and we said no. So this is something that could be done during the original configuration, but if it's not, well then we do it this way by going to the Properties and to the Security tab. And what you'll see here is that we can change the authentication and or accounting from regular Windows over to Radius. So as a for instance, if I take the authentication provider and pull this down and switch to Radius authentication, I click the configure button. I then need to configure a Radius server that we're going to go to, so I'll click add and put in New York DC1 2K8. And of course the shared secret, we need to change that to 1234, right? Click OK. And OK once again. This takes just a moment while it does a quick query, but otherwise what we've now done is we've made it that all authentication will be done via the Radius server, not via the local remote access server. Now we can do the same thing for accounting. Change it from Windows. We can actually change it to none if we want, meaning if you just don't care about accounting at all, you can make that part of it go away. Whereas you'll notice with authentication, you can't really do that. The closest you can do with that on authentication, as we saw in the last video, was change the authentication method to unauthenticated. But anyway, for Windows accounting, we go to Radius accounting and click configure. Now you might be thinking to yourself, didn't we just add that Radius server already? Well, we did, but we have to add it again. And the reason why is because we may not want the exact same Radius server to handle authentication as handling accounting. We might have it separated into two different Radius servers. But in this case, it is the same server, so I'll put in the same New York DC1, click change for our shared secret, put in the 1234, click OK, OK, and OK one more time. And again, this takes just a moment because it's doing a quick query to make sure that that Radius server does exist, and it does. So now everything that has to do with remote access connectivity on this remote access VPN server is going to be managed through the Radius server. So let me click OK to get out of here, and you'll notice it says for new authentication you must restart, and for new accounting you must restart. I'll click OK. Now this does take a moment here where it seemingly restarts the services, but I'll tell you what, I've noticed that it does not always do so. So what I recommend is, based upon those messages that we just received, you right click on the server again, go to all tasks, and just select restart. That will make certain that you have indeed restarted those services and everything is being managed through Radius. Now once this has completed, I will show you that first of all right here where it says remote access logging and policies, if I click on it, you'll notice that this is all done through network policy services. Okay, it talks all about network policy services here. So we don't do anything locally here. It's all done through the network policy server. So let me go ahead and go away from New York member 1 for just a moment and go back to New York DC1, which is our NPS server, and go to our network policies. Now you'll notice that by default you have a couple of deny access policies. Okay, so by default nobody is allowed access into this remote access VPN server. Okay, matter of fact, if we were to go into more detail, what we would find is that although this is a deny access, this has not been set to override the manual Active Directory settings. Okay, so if we go into Active Directory, I'll click Start, Administrative Tools, Active Directory, Users and Computers. And we saw this in the last video. You'll see here, I'm going to go to the administrator account and then go to the dial-in tab, and you will see that we had that changed to allow access, because that was in the last video. We wanted to manually allow access to the administrator. Well, I'm going to change that back to control through NPS network policy. And if I click OK, what this means is that if we were to attempt to connect as the administrator, or anybody for that matter, we're not going to get in, because all of the users in the Global Mantics network have been set to not allowing, or actually to be real clear, all of the users have been set to control through NPS network policy. And the only network policies that exist are the ones that say, go away, you're denied. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and create a network policy that allows all or maybe certain users to go ahead and get in. Now before we do that, I would like to show you that we cannot get in as the administrator. So let's switch over to our Vista computer and try to connect and see what happens. Alright, here we are back on the Vista client, and what I'm going to do is go to Network. I'm going to actually right click, go to Properties, and then Manage Network Connections, and here you'll see our VPN to the Global Mantics network. I'm going to double click on it, put in administrator, password's already, all of this stuff's already been saved from when we did this in the last video, and click Connect. And you will see here that when we go to verify the username and password, we can't get in. And the reason we can't get in is because there's no network policy to allow it. So let me go ahead and switch back over to our network policy server, and we'll set up a policy to get the administrator in. Okay, back here on our network policy server, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on network policies, and I'm going to select new. And I'm going to name this policy allow administrators. Okay, so that's just one example that we're going to do, is we're going to allow the administrators the ability to remote access in. So down here, type of network access server, we don't need to go into anything specific. We could leave it unspecified, but because we do know it's a VPN server, I'm going to go ahead and select that now. Click Next. Now the first thing we need to do is set a condition that has to be met in order for, it's not to allow access. I will tell you that. The conditions have to do with determining if this is the policy that we're going to use on this connection. See, the conditions of our default policies are anybody dialing in 24/7. See, if I click on Add, you will see here, let me scroll down a little bit, you'll see that you can do a day and time restriction. I will show you, I'll go back and show you in a minute, that the default policy uses a day and time restriction that says if anybody's dialing in Sunday through Saturday from midnight through midnight, so 24/7, you've met the conditions of this policy. And that's why those policies are implemented all the time. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to do a Windows group condition, right? Because we want to have this be for the administrators. So I'm going to click Add, and then I need to determine a group. So I'm going to click Add Groups, and I'm going to put in domain, and I'll put Add. That should be enough. Let me click Check Names. There you go. Domain Admins. I'm going to click OK, and OK, and then click Next. After we've set the conditions that will determine if this policy is going to be used, we have to decide, is this a policy that grants or denies access? Well, we're going to go ahead and say that access is granted based upon this policy. I'm going to click Next. Now we need to configure what authentication methods we're willing to use. So this is where we're getting to exact criteria that has to be met for the connection itself. And you'll notice here that we're supporting MS Chap and MS Chap version 2. So that's fine. That's what we want to support here. Next. Now I can go through and put additional constraints. I could say if the user who's connected is idle for X amount of time, I could disconnect them. I'm not going to do any of this. I'm just going to show you some of these things. We could do and actually let me go back to previous. We could do a session timeout, meaning if they have been connected for a certain amount of time. See, this was if they're idle for a certain amount of time. This is if they're connected for a certain amount of time at all. You might say, look, you can connect, but in 15 minutes, I'm kicking you off. There might be too many other users who need to get their turn. We can go into, look at this. Let me jump down to day and time restrictions. Even though that was a condition originally to determine if it was this particular policy that was going to be used, now this is an actual constraint that you'll put on the policy itself. So there's a lot of choices that we have here. I'm going to click on Next. We can go in here and do all kinds of additional things with encryption, IP filtering, NAP enforcement. Click Next and complete what we're going to do, which is finish. And now we have our Allow Administrators policy. Now, you'll notice that Allow Administrators is above these previous two, and that is significant. The reason it is significant is because these policies will be looked at in order to determine which one is going to be used. And if this one was on top, or actually I should say this one, if this one was on top, you'll notice that it has a condition of a day and time restriction of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and if I were to continue scrolling all the way over, it would be all the way through to Saturday from midnight to midnight. So if this one were to be up top, then it would always win, and there would be no point to creating this additional policy. So this first policy on the list is going to basically say, hey, if you're a member of the domain admins, use this policy, and this policy is going to let you in. If you're a member of anybody else, meaning you're not a member of the domain admins group, then it's going to skip this one and go down to the next one and to the next one until it finds a policy that fits. So now that we have a network policy that we've set up, let's see if it works. I'm going to switch back over to our Vista client and try to connect as administrator again. Alright, back here on our Vista client, here's our VPN connection. I'm going to double click on it. Our credentials are already entered. I'm going to click connect, and you'll notice that I get past, it goes by very quickly, but I got past all the verifying and registering, and now we are connected. Okay, and I know it doesn't say connected there. It defaulted to giving me the name of the domain, but if I wanted to see if I was connected, all I'd have to do is go to a command prompt. Well, there's a couple things I could do. One, I could go to a command prompt and put in ipconfig and see that I have my PPP adapter, my VPN adapter with a valid IP address. And then the other thing I could do is I could actually attempt to make connectivity with internal servers. So what we've done is we have successfully created an NPS radius server, and then we've taken our remote access server and pointed it to that radius server, and thereby making it a radius client. Now, the one thing I will tell you is in our scenario, we said that Global Mantix has multiple remote access servers throughout the network, and they all need to point to this radius server. Well, I'll tell you what. If we wanted to do that, all we have to do is go create some more remote access servers and go through the exact same steps that we did with the first server. There's nothing that would change at all on a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth server. The process would all be identical. Let's go take a look at what we've covered in this video. Okay, well, at this point you should now know how to install the Network Policy Server role. And remember that technically Network Policy Server is a role service which is contained within the Network Policy and Access Services role. You should know how to configure the NPS server as a radius server and configure the remote access server as a radius client and get them talking to each other. And you should also know how to create network policies to be able to control access to your network. Alright, well, that's pretty much it for Network Policy Server. I will see you in the next video.